Hi guys, so here is my challenge submission. It's a force field type object, solid ring in the middle which creates a force field bubble either side, almost like a sort of capsule, which is then all sat on top of a big control console. So originally I'd got an idea for a ball type force field object, but I was going for more of a alien sort of feel. So this was my original plan, and it was going to be sort of like a giant eye inside an eye socket, or like a sort of seed pod. And it was going to be a bit dark and slimy, and it would have been a mixture of both of like biological and mechanical. I got a few hours into modelling this, and I took a break, and when I come back I just couldn't pick it back up. I couldn't get back into it, so I knew that it just wasn't the right sort of thing for me. So I went back to the drawing board and I started tinkering with a few things, and I still liked the idea of the ball force field, but since that I'd got a model of a ball, I thought, well, what happens if I cut it down the middle and I put a solid strip in there? And as soon as I did, and I came up with this sort of idea, and straight away I knew what it was. I knew what it was going to be. So it was like the solid strip in the middle was going to be a ring, which was going to be like the emitter, and that created two halves of the ball either side as the force field. So this was the general plan. As I was modelling it, I was splitting everything up into various different materials, which would make it easier to then create the UV maps, because in the 3D app that I use, Lightwave 3D, you can create UVs based on selected materials or selected parts. So I was doing it by materials to make it easier. Then once I had created all the UV maps, I compressed all the materials back down into just three, which was for the three main parts of the object, which were the console, the what I call the ring, which also includes the force field, and then finally the item which was being kept inside the force field, which was, as I call it, the gem. And so there's the UV map for that as well. The reason that I did it like this and compressed it all down into three materials is loading it into Substance Painter. If I left it as all of those materials, then it would have created a texture set for every single material. And the thing is, there's at least 3 or 4 objects or meshes that all use the same textures, or could all use the same textures. I thought I might as well compress them all down. It's more economical on materials and things like that. Once I'd finished in Substance Painter and I'd got it to spit out just 3 sets of textures, which again were the console, the ring and the gem, I was then able to go back in and split the object back up into the individual materials. So although things like the console, although the screens and the buttons both use the same texture, and they both use, for example, an emissive map to make them light up, they have different amounts of emission. I wanted to be able to have those as separate materials, so I could change essentially the brightness of one of the materials without it altering the brightness of the other ones. Finally, I was ready to set up the scene and render it, and I know in the brief it said we don't have to create a room for the object. I actually thought it would work better using just like a HDRI or something like that. It's great for lighting, but it doesn't account for things like light bounces. So I created a basic room, which as you can see in the render is that. A lot of the details are actually in the normal maps, so that's why the walls look plain white. To light the scene, I actually modelled a physical light mesh and I gave that a very, very high emissive property, so it is producing light, and I'm using those 9 physical lights to create half the light in the room, and then I've also created 9 point lights just below that, fill out the rest of the room. And so the computer lights, they work better with the rendering of the global illuminations. It's a lot easier for the system to calculate, so I added those to take up the rest of the weight for the render engine. There are a couple of things that I'm not absolutely over the moon about. One of them, on the edges of the force field, you can see the hexagonal pattern is stretching slightly. I didn't realise when I created the force field that I'd unwrapped it wrong. It was just the very edges were slightly wrong and I hadn't noticed. And by the time I'd created everything, I went back in and I tried to manually edit the UV map to account for it, but I just couldn't get that fixed. I know the solution for next time would be unwrap the entire ball as a ball rather than trying to unwrap it as 2 separate halves of a ball, which is what the problem was. And the other thing that I wasn't very happy with, the coloured buttons on the console, they're flat, as in like it's just a solid colour and they light up. I really wanted to try and make them look like that coloured clear Perspex buttons, and there's a light behind the plastic. I really would have liked to have got that look, and I think it's a cross between having it slightly transparent and also applying a texture with a pattern that looks like plastic. And I think that would have fixed it, but I didn't have the time to try and work on that. I'd spent so much time creating textures, and you probably won't even notice them in the picture, but the textures for the 5 screens, they took several hours to make, and you probably can't even make out what the writing on them says. I think it came out okay. Hopefully you guys do as well. Thanks for taking a look, and thanks for considering my submission.